The school boards think that they have the right to impose their ideology on our children. That's not why we send our kids to school.
The whole official approval of drugs industry has been nothing but a scam and really a crime spree.
You and I both believe that during COVID, if there were more people that stood up and said, I will not comply, I will not go along with this, it would have been over long ago. But they chose safety and they chose convenience.
They can stand there on a rainy day and tell you it's a beautiful sunny sky. And they think because they got the TV camera pointed at them, financed by the government and its propaganda campaigns, that it makes it real.
There's starting to be some accountability for the lies and the deception that is happening, particularly by the pharmaceutical industry.
They didn't want Dr. Charles Hoff saying things or Dr. Patrick Phillips saying things or Reiner Fuhrman's going after them because they were poisoning you and your family.
The fact that this is allowed to persist as long as it has is just, like I said, it's criminal behavior.
Hello, friends. Dr. Merv Trozy here with my very good friend, Ted Kuntz, President of Vaccine Choice Canada, co-founder of the National Citizens Inquiry, general all-around hero to mankind. And we are here to celebrate the wins of the week. And this is going to be the wins of the week for the week that is ending January 17th. Ted, it's always good to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm great. And this is what, our 108th episode, I think, Mark? Boy.
Wow, we had no idea how well we were going to get along when we got started, eh?
I know. We thought it was going to be a short love affair and be over by now, but no, it's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you liked my cooking because my looks weren't quite cutting it, but the cooking was incredible. So,
and your jokes, they're much better than Vincent Gersey's jokes. So,
well, yeah, but boy, geez, you know what I love about Vince? He's truly a detective because when you talk to him, you could see that, not in a bad way, he's kind of seeing right through you. You know, like he's observing everything. So it's no wonder he was able to detect the great big BS alert when COVID was launched. Speaking of COVID being launched and the unfortunate effects of the genetic toxic injection, we still have people embedded in governments like Canada trying to pretend nothing happened here and everything's fine. But as you know, a lot of people are hurt and a lot of people are dead and a lot of people are looking for answers. And we have discovered a lot of answers over the last 4 years of research. And so I want to thank folks who've come to help the Trozy team with the startup fundraiser to bring out unquestionably the most advanced help for people with an affordable budget to deal with the toxic effects of the shot. So I just want to thank people, and Ted, and you included, I know you contributed in that. The team is really grateful. So folks, please stay with us on that project. We're around the quarter mark of able to do this, and you can be sure it's on a lean budget. There'll be no Mercedes Benzes and steak dinners involved in this process. Speaking of which, Ted, well, we're going to come to that later. We've got a beautiful piece of music and a hell of a story that's going to bring tears of joy and beauty to your eyes, folks. But I guess we should probably jump into the classic lineup of the wins of the week. Last week was an incredible week, Ted. It's a hard one to follow, but luckily there's some incredible things that have happened.
yeah, I think there's a win that happened actually yesterday that is probably the win of the year, or maybe a couple of years. For those that may not be aware, is that back in 2022, of course, the Trudeau government invoked the Emergency Act, claiming that, Canada was in crisis, and I mean it was in crisis, but it wasn't from peaceful protesters. There was a court case, and Judge Mosley back in 2024 ruled that the invoking of the Emergency Act was unlawful and unjustified. But of course, the Liberal government couldn't accept that, and so they appealed that decision, and the decision of the appeal court came down yesterday, Friday, January the 16th, and they unanimously denied the appeal of the federal government. This is what they stated. They said, we are of the opinion that every appeal before this court should be dismissed. I mean, and when they say that, they're talking about the appeals because there were multiple appeals by the federal government. And they said the federal court correctly determined that the declaration of a public order emergency was unreasonable. Boy, that's a pretty straight message right there. and
Yeah.
said that the federal court made no reviewable error with regard to standing or in admitting evidence that was before the Public Order Emergency Commission. So this is a pretty clear takedown of the decision by the Liberal government to invoke that Emergency Act. So it's the second slapdown by the federal court. And Mark, I'm pleased for a couple of reasons. One is that they stood by the previous decision and deemed that the invoking of the Emergency Act was unreasonable, unconstitutional, and therefore illegal. But it also tells me that, just maybe, in your words, is that there's a pulse in some of the courts within this country still. So I was pretty tickled with that decision. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree for sure that it's a positive thing. I have to admit, in this one, I feel a little bit like, the last kid in the classroom who's been having trouble spelling the word cat for a long time, but is working on it. And they've now articulated 2 plus 2 is 4, and we're all really excited. And I know that's a bit sarcastic, but and this is where I feel like, on the one hand, this is a great win, but on the other hand, by no means does this have me restore my faith in the legal system in
Mhm.
Canada at this point. By no means I think this should have us go, oh, great, finally law and order is working in the country. We can all go home now. Because, we get thrown bones a lot, but a lot of times trick is getting some meat off the bones. And, just this, it was 2022 when Mosley ruled that it was unlawful and unjustified. And unlawful and unjustified, it wasn't just about declaring an emergency act. It was about stealing people's assets. It was
Right.
about criminalizing people, locking people up. It was about leading women like Tamara Leach in shackles in courtroom. It was about trying to force the entire population to take a toxic genetic injection and doing a pretty good odd job of it. And when the truck driver stood up and said, no, we don't want to take that toxic injection to do our job, and put the bouncy castles up, and then the emergency declaration was made rather than any negotiation, any conversation, and then they plowed over crowds of people with horses and military officers of some sort, some of which we still don't know where they came from,
Right.
and nobody's paid a price. And these appeal processes are being financed by the very people that did it. For instance, the unelected part of the cabal named Mark Carney. So I have a balanced feelings about this. I Maybe there's some room for redemption of some of the people in the court system, but I think we shouldn't stop doing everything else we're doing to
Oh,
ensure our survival. That's for sure.
okay, without a doubt, without a doubt. And I'm with you, is that the next step should be some kind of accountability. So who's going to be held to account for those decisions and the consequences of those decisions that, as you say, stole people's livelihoods, put people in jail, froze bank accounts, et cetera, et cetera. But the win for me, Mark, I mean, if this had gone the other way yesterday, that would be a very sad state of affairs in this country. And so I got to think that those judges before the appeal court had to be under incredible pressure from political forces to side with the government, and they didn't. And so all I'm saying is that I think there's a little ray of at least some integrity somewhere in the system, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean the next court case will be done correctly. But I just want to
Yeah.
acknowledge that if this decision yesterday had gone the other way, I think I'd be in a much more difficult place than I am today.
Yeah, I agree. And to put a more optimistic spin and a more positive spin, I mean, we've talked about this before, Ted, is at what point do judges look at their kids and their grandkids sleeping and think about it and realize, and if they've attended enough of their own funerals, and some of them got their own health problems, and they're starting to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and then maybe making that quantum leap spiritually to doing the
Yeah.
right thing
Yeah.
regardless of the money. And so, yeah, this could be a wonderful thing, and it's great news for sure. Speaking of great news, north of the 49th, Alberta is in the process of people coming together to sign a referendum. And we reported on this a few weeks ago that, yes, there'll be signatures. And now, Ted, you've got an update on how is anybody showing up to sign the referendum question to say that Alberta wants to have a voting, legitimate referendum on whether or not to exit the Westminster Canadian system of dictatorship?
Well, in my Freedom Leaders meeting yesterday, I asked that question because there's a number of Albertans that are in that meeting, included Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who spoke up about this. And they were giddy, Mark. They just said that the lineups of people outside of the facilities that are accepting people's signatures are 2 to 3 hours long. They're standing out in the cold and
Wow.
the snow. And he
Come
said,
on.
but the energy, he said, people are laughing, they're hugging. There's a just a joy in that crowd that's lined up outside. And they described one of the facilities that they still had a long lineup at 10 o'clock at night, and they finally had to shut the doors and say, please come back tomorrow because people wanted to go home. But, I've heard the stories of people that for 8 hours they took signatures from people. So there's a pretty interesting thing happening. And of course, I suspect you'll not see this on mainstream media anywhere, but there are some videos out there that I've seen of the long lineups that go completely around the building, and people they're not leaving line until they put their signature on that piece of paper. So I think that's pretty exciting.
Oh, that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. We may legitimately look at the foundation of a legitimate nation north
Yeah.
of the United States in the region of Alberta. That is a great news.
Yeah.
Well, Ted, we got some good news out of the United Kingdom as well. Speaking of the digital prison that they're trying to have everyone self-assemble. And so, after massive public backlash, the UK government announced that it is scrapping its plan for mandatory digital ID for those working in the United Kingdom. So, under the proposed legislation, anyone starting a job would have been required to show their digital ID. Before the UK Prime Minister announced his plans for digital ID, nearly 6 in 10 voters backed him and his government. After the announcement, support dropped to just under 4 in 10 in favor, with nearly half opposed. And a cabinet minister described this as a massive U turn. So, government sources also said that the changes would combat conspiracy theorists who say digital IDs are about state control of people's lives. Well, they're still shameless. Ted, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I have no confidence that the UK government is going to back down off a digital ID. To me, that's part of the global agenda. But the good news here is that there was a backlash by the public, and at least at the time being, they have backed down. So they've successfully put a spoke into the wheels of this tyranny. But I had to laugh at the last line, Mark, that you read, is that government sources say that, their decision to back down was important because it combats conspiracy theorists who say that digital ID is about state control. Yeah, that's exactly what it's about. And that's why I have no doubt that they'll try to introduce this again under some different guise or some different justification, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they sure. I mean, let's face it, UK, the United Kingdom, just like here, needs to completely scrap the Westminster system of government. And we're certainly with you, folks. God bless everybody in the UK. Thanks for rejecting digital ID, and you're going to have to keep your foot on that gas pedal.
Yeah, yeah. Here's a good one, Mark. This is south of the border, but there are several states and hundreds of school districts where they have adjusted the traditional teacher salary structures, which is typically based on years of service, and they're replacing it with a system that's based upon merit and what they're calling pay for performance models. The changes is a result of the success of the Dallas Independent School Program that was implemented in 2016 and really made a dramatic shift to what they were witnessing as declining academic achievement in districts throughout the United States. And so the comments were is that they said a merit-based system where you can measure performance is the way that most of the world operates. But in public education, it's considered to be a crazy phenomena to base salary upon merit. What they say is that union contracts typically are centered on rewarding seniority. And the union has consistently opposed any kind of pay for performance or merit system. In fact, the National Education Association states that any system of compensation that's based on evaluation of an education employee's performance is, in their words, inappropriate. Well, I think the good news, Mark, is that there are hundreds of school districts are saying, you know what, we're going to start to reward based upon merit, not based upon the number of years that you sat in a seat. So I think that's a nice shift and hope that that grows throughout not only the United States, but Canada.
That's great. And I love that. I mean, again, we're seeing that same thing, just the complete shamelessness of these delusional people. The National Education Association states any system of compensation based on an evaluation of an education employee's performance is inappropriate. Like, don't you just, you only have to say, like, a sane human being just has to say that while looking in the mirror and then go, oh, clearly I'm wrong. Like, clearly I'm not making sense here. I'm saying, I don't want my performance to depend on what you do for me. You do for me because I've been sitting in this chair as opposed to because I'm doing a great job. And you know what? This is the free market coming back
Yeah.
and now in education. And I agree with it 100%. I mean, communism wasn't really successful, and I think this is a better way to go.
Well, Mark, and it wasn't said anywhere in this article, but I gotta wonder, all this DEI nonsense that's being imposed upon our kids and stuff. I wonder how much a merit-based system might put an end to that. Because if parents and students are downgrading those teachers that, push that narrative and their pay is half of what, a fellow teacher is getting, maybe that would be the way to stop this silliness from happening in our schools.
Yeah. Hey, Ted, I've got some friends who are good friends who are school teachers. Shout out to Lionel. And I think they would welcome this because
Mhm.
what I've noticed in my conversations over the last decade plus with my friends who are teachers is they're consistently having their hands tied so they can't just do a great job of what they want to do, which is to help kids become smart, evolved, socially enlightened beings. Instead, they're having to, check words off. They're not even allowed to just write free form comments anymore. Like you get those notes. Remember in your report card, I used to
Right.
get notes.
Yeah.
Mark's pretty smart, but he needs to be more patient with others. And my dad said, hey, let's talk about this. But now teachers are having to choose phrases. This is in China to, choose phrases. So you get this note from your teacher, and it's not very genuine because they're to
Say
not
anything.
allowed to just say what they think. So well done in Dallas, folks, and let's all go that way. I think north of the 49th, let's face it, probably if you have kids and you can in any way do it, your kids probably don't go to the public school system. They probably are part of a private homeschool network where you do exactly this kind of thing. And maybe I'm really encouraging still, Ted. We talked about this, for people to look for those teachers that have been turfed from the educational system because they wouldn't help screw up your kids and hire them as part of your school co-op. And you know what? Pay them for doing a great job.
Yeah.
If your kids are hitting university at 13 years old and doing great, why not pay them well? I think that's the way to go, the free market.
Absolutely.
Ted, we got something this has been an interesting week, and I'd love you to report about this. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s message to Germany, and I'm thinking, of course, of Reiner Fuellmich and others there currently in prison.
Yeah, so Bobby Kennedy delivered a formal letter to Germany's Federal Minister of Health condemning the prosecution, and I want to say persecution, of physicians who issued COVID-era mask and vaccine exemptions. And Kennedy's message was unambiguous. He said that when governments criminalize doctors for advising patients, they cross a line that basically should not be crossed. And there was a Substack writer by the name of DG who wrote about this, and he said, for Canadians who witnessed similar actions at home, most notably the persecution of Dr. Charles Hoff, Dr. Mark Crozy, Dr. Mary O'Connor, Dr. Patrick Phillips, Dr. Chris Shoemaker, and others, this moment raises an unavoidable question. Will the United States, will Bobby Kennedy extend the same concern to Canada? And for Canadians who suffered professional, financial, or personal harm during this period, the U.S. intervention offers something rare, external validation that a line was crossed. The question is no longer whether overreach occurred, but whether governments will acknowledge it, correct it, and ensure it never happens again. Pretty interesting move by Kennedy, huh?
Yeah, amen to RFK. He's been hitting a lot of balls out of the park lately and choosing very well. And Ted, I think this a lot of people are going to like this say, well, that's great. That's a win for doctors in Germany and nurses in Germany. I mean, some of them are literally imprisoned. Like I have friends
Right.
in Germany. They've been locking up doctors in the last months because of exemptions they wrote to facial diapers 2, 3 years ago. Never mind toxic, deadly, misrepresented genetic bioweapons, really. And so I think a lot of people, and then, oh, wow, I think, look, Charles Hoff, Dr. Trozy, Dr. O'Connor, yeah, like maybe this will extend to Canada. Maybe they'll reach out to Dr. Shoemaker and say, oh my God, you wonderful senior physician. We're
Mm.
so sorry for what we did. We were wrong. Please, let's give you your license and like let's just settle out of court and give you 100 grand because you've lost your home and every single thing you did for doing the Hippocratic Oath, being a good doctor and all this. So yeah, this is good news potentially for doctors and nurses, but people,
Maybe,
you got to remember what this was all about, which is they didn't want Dr. Charles Hoff saying things or Dr. Patrick Phillips saying things or Reiner Fuhrman's going after them because they were poisoning you and your family. So this is again, I know it's a little biased because you could say, well, you're one of the doctors. Yep, I sure am and proud of it.
yeah.
But again, what happened to the doctors was just one byproduct of what was being done to kill you and your family. So this issue should reach everybody. And I think it's another reason that we should say a prayer for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the
Mm.
whole team at HHS doing the big cleansing.
I think I should send Bobby a letter and suggest that he writes a letter to Canada about guys like you, Mark. So I'll see what I
That's a
can
great
do.
idea. I will be honored to be in that group right there. Look at my name next to Mary O'Connor. I love her. She's one of my heroes. Well, here's something. This is according to Dr. Francis Widdowson. The Canadian Privacy Commissioner has ordered the government to release files related to the Kamloops Indian School excavation of purported mass graves, and the files need to be released in the next 36 days. Ted, you know a lot about this. Just for folks to understand, part of the divide and conquer in Canada is the divide and conquer between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, or First Nations and non-First Nations people. And remember, they injected everybody with the poison. They went after the natives hardcore. Remember, go back to 2021, 22, how hardcore women crying, their kids being dragged away from them by cops and shot up with stuff. Stuff like that was going on out there in BC. So part of their divide and conquer has been this, saying there's mass graves, hundreds of bodies buried of all these children.
Yeah.
And Ted, you've been on top of this. So what do you think about this privacy commissioner ordering the government to release the files? Like, what did you find when you got the shovels out and excavated the zone?
Well, and that's the issue is that the Kamloops Indian Band was given, I don't know how many millions of dollars it was to investigate these so-called mass graves. And of course, nothing has happened. They haven't put one shovel into the ground to the best of my knowledge, and have been actively resisting doing that. And I think it's because the narrative is a false narrative, and they're enjoying the benefits of this narrative without, anything to account for. But Francis Widdowson has been really one of the strongest voices about, let's investigate this. Let's just not accept the claim that children were, buried in graves outside of the Kamloops Indian School, and the band was given money in fact, to do that. And I don't know who's responsible for pushing the Federal Privacy Commissioner to make this decision, but I think it's a great decision, and we're gonna find out what the federal government knew, what kind of correspondence has been going on between the federal government and the Kamloops Indian Band. But what's interesting, Mark, is that I saw this as I think it was a Twitter post from, or it was on YouTube from Dr. Widdowson. I have not seen this being reported anywhere else, so I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this. But I bought the book for Christmas, or I got the book for Christmas on what was it called? Mass Deception, or anyways, it's about the Kamloops situation, and I think it's highly unlikely that there's mass graves there in Kamloops.
Yeah. And it's interesting, again, this shows the kind of psyop that's being used all over the place,
Yep.
where, just thinking if somebody says, hey, I think there's hundreds of kids' bodies buried in the yard. What are we gonna do about it? It's like, well, we better go have a look. That's serious. That's a serious allegation. We
Yeah, it's
better
a
dig it up
criminal
and find
offense.
out. But to say we're not gonna look, and if somebody says we should look, it's like, well, you're obviously you hate indigenous people
Right.
because you're trying to cover up the dead bodies. No, I'm trying to uncover them. Think of that. Covering them up is the opposite of digging them up because you uncover a body when you get the dirt off the top. So,
Yeah.
oh, well, thanks to Dr. Widdowson. He's taken a lot of
She.
abuse
Yeah.
from the radical. globalist sort of operatives
Yeah.
for wanting to dig up the bodies and see what's going on,
Yeah.
if they exist. Well, here's something out of British Columbia. The BC Minister of Health, Jossie Osborne, says the province won't ask Health Canada to renew its exemption from Canada's federal drug laws that was granted in January 2023 and is set to expire at the end of this month. Folks, if you're not aware of that, if you're in BC before this thing's expired, you want to shoot some heroin, you want to smoke some crack, no problem. Paid for and supplied by the government, and you can abuse a nurse in a facility while she's shooting the heroin up for you and insist on it. If that sounds crazy to you, well, this is kind of good news. So, this pilot program decriminalized personal possession and use of 2.5 grams, not of dope, not of weed, folks, 2.5 grams or less of cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, and opiates for people over 18 years, in a move that the province said was intended to decrease the stigma over drug use and encourage treatment for addicts. But anyways, BC Premier David Eby has said that BC's drug decriminalization program didn't work as intended.
No
Well,
kidding.
thanks, David. You should have listened to somebody with knowledge on the subject before millions of people died. Or no, I should say thousands in that case. Anyways, he said, we are not going back to the old policy of decriminalized public drug use in British Columbia. Well done, David Eby. 2 + 2 is 4, sir. Drug overdoses have claimed more than 16,047 lives in BC since 2016. And now, one commentator described this decriminalization of hardcore drugs as MAID 2.0 without the paperwork. Quite true. And of
Yeah.
course, MAID, folks, medical assistance in dying, Canada's the leading on it. Doctors can make money killing you. So you're a BC folk. What do you think about this situation?
Well, this has been a terrible initiative, and it was obvious from the very beginning. You don't decriminalize possession of these kinds of hard drugs. What this was allowing is open use of the drugs, that the government was even providing the drugs so that there was, in their words, a safe supply. And it has really turned a lot of cities, particularly Vancouver, for example, into just a drug playground. And the consequences of this were obvious before it started, but clearly after it started. And the fact that they allowed this to run the entire 2 years is just pure insanity. But I think it was, the arrogance or the lack of humility of our BC government, who didn't want to admit that maybe they had made a mistake with this one. Now, what remains to be seen is whether there'll be some enforcement around the open use of drugs. And, right now, this is just words on a paper that says that we're not going to continue the program, or not, we're not going to ask for permission to continue the program, but they really have to do something different. They have to stop the open use of drugs anywhere in this province. The way it's being done is putting others at risk as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it is sad that, here that they're not saying, holy crow, this doesn't work. 16,000 people are dead. We best stop. They're like, well, we're not going to renew it, but for today, come on, kids, come on down. If you're 18 plus, get yourself a little crack and feel free to be abusive to the nurse who's giving it to you.
Well, and Mark, I
So,
have to tell you is that I lived in downtown Vancouver for many years before I moved to Kelowna, and there's an elementary school that's about 2 blocks from my house. And every morning before the kids come to school, staff have to thoroughly review the playground of the school to remove needles and drugs and that kind of paraphernalia. Every day they have to do that.
what a disaster. Well, at least David Eby and his friends aren't going to renew their request to keep that going.
Yeah.
But I again, folks in BC, so many good people in BC, keep your foot on the pedal because you are by no means out of the wood just because David Eby said he won't
Yeah.
reapply to give your kids crack. Well, that brings us into some medicine and health, and we've got one particular item, and this comes from someone I'm very honored to be a co-researcher with. Folks, if you're aware of the Villa research team with Dr. Bridle, Nick Hulsher, Dr. Villa, of course, David Speaker, the eminent David Speaker, and Dr. William Mackis and myself. Anyways, this is someone I'm very fond of and very grateful to be a colleague with. Nick Hulsher stated in an X post this. He said, there are over 100 studies that find a positive association between vaccines and neural development disorders and autism. All major artificial intelligence systems, that includes SuperCroc, ChatGPT-5, and Google Gemini, independently concluded, based on scientific studies, that vaccines cause autism. Vaccines cause autism after analyzing the landmark study. And the 30-year lie that vaccines don't cause autism has officially collapsed. It's over, folks. Ted, no one has worked harder that I know in the world on this subject for this entire multiple decades. What are your thoughts on Nick's statement?
Well, to me, this is finally acknowledging something that to me has been obvious for a long time. I mean, I think it's actually a criminal that this lie that vaccines don't cause autism has been allowed to persist. I mean, we've witnessed in our lifetime, Mark, autism go from less than 1 in 10,000 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 25. Some places 1 in 30. In California, I understand it's like 1 in 16, 1 in 17. And this is not just, like measles or something. These are lifelong conditions, and particularly with severe autism, that requires 24-hour care. I know that a number of years ago when I did the research, they estimated that the lifetime cost to care for one child with autism, with severe autism, is $5 million. This is the fact that this is allowed to persist as long as it has is just, like I said, it's criminal behavior. Finally, there's some acknowledgement, growing acknowledgement that vaccines do cause autism, and this has to be stopped.
Yeah. And we need to warn folks, Ted, it's a few weeks ago we reported that believe it's the CDC had acknowledged that the statement vaccines don't cause autism has no scientific basis. But, young mom and dad going on the CDC website to check what we're talking about, the statement is still there. Vaccines do not cause autism, asterisks. And if you follow the asterisks, then you find out where it says there's no scientific evidence to support this statement. So people still need to do their homework on this one. And you can see that even though the reality, like what you described, Ted, is somewhere in the order of a million-fold increase in autism
Yeah.
over these decades. And even though the evidence is overwhelming, and we have good people, for instance, in the HHS, in the CDC now, you still have terrible people in there. And the lie is still there on the CDC site, along with a
Yeah.
footnote saying this isn't true. So please, folks, tell people with children, make sure they're aware, send them a copy of the new parents guide to vaccination from Vaccine Choice Canada, because once that needle's in, you can't take it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we got some legal wins, don't we, Ted?
We do. So this one is a Chilliwack. That's a small community in British Columbia outside of the Lower Mainland. A pastor there was ticketed for in-person worship during lockdowns. Well, his matter has finally been set aside by the Provincial Court of BC. He was supported by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, thanks to them again, and they announced that both convictions had been vacated for Pastor John Koopman of the Free Reformed Church in Chilliwack. And in 2022, Koopman was charged with violating the in-person gathering prohibition during the COVID so-called pandemic. And part of the argument of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom was that bars, restaurants, gym salons, and other venues for secular gatherings were permitted to operate on an in-person basis. And Koopman said that he welcomed the correction, but also pointed out accountability remains lacking. Yes, that's now the issue. We've now figured out that people like Dr. Henry and Teresa Tam and others lie to us, impose tyrannical measures, and that was just affirmed by the Federal Appeals Court. The next step is somebody needs to be held to account.
Yeah, 100% agree with that, Ted. And Ted, this highlights another thing. And I find when the globalists try to, put a zipper over our mouth on certain subjects, it's especially good to talk about them. And there is definitely a globalist targeting specifically of Christians. Now, I'm not saying that all kinds of people aren't being targeted, but why is Christianity so heavily targeted? And I think that's because the idea that you personally can have your own relationship with God where you are seen as beautiful and loved despite your sins and shortcomings, and that you can be possessed by God and act in this world as a light, as a representative of God, that doesn't go very well for authoritarianism. And so I deeply honor and salute this Chilliwack pastor and the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms for holding the ground on this one.
Well, and Mark, you raise a good point because I'm just going to say I'm not aware of any those of the Muslim faith where their facilities were shut down during this time. I'm not aware of anybody in the Jewish faith where their facilities were shut down, and yet Christian pastors over and over and over again were shut down and severely fined. And so that's pretty curious when you think about it, isn't it?
It is curious, Ted, and to demonstrate our multicultural enlightenment here, there was a similar thing going on in the communist dictatorship of China with people practicing Qigong. And Qigong is maybe a little more on the Buddhist side of maybe related to the experience of a Holy Spirit by a Christian. But this people were literally being banned from standing still and moving their body gently and moving energy and interacting with their chi,
Mhm.
interfacing with the great Tao. The idea that you would close your eyes, meditate, pray, do anything of that sort, and be inspired to make choices and decisions in life rather than follow orders, that might work wonderful for building a beautiful, enlightened society, but that does not work for authoritarianism. So,
Yeah,
yeah, hats off to the good pastor there,
yeah. And the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom.
as always. So, what do we got here, Ted, from the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, there's two landmark cases that are before the U.S. Supreme Court actually this week that will impact women and girls sports throughout the United States. And this has got to do with whether, men who are confused about, their sexuality should be able to play in women's sports. But as part of this hearing that happened this week, the attorney for the American Civil Liberties Association, so you need to understand it's the American Civil Liberties Association that's arguing that confused men should be able to play in women's sports. I mean, I just think that they've lost their way as well. Anyways, the attorney was challenged by Judge Alto because the attorney was unable to define a man or a woman. And so this is how it happened. The judge asked, he said, so what is the definition? For equal protection purposes, what does it mean to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman? And the attorney said that she didn't have an answer. And the judge responded. He said, "Well, how can a court determine whether there's discrimination on the basis of sex without knowing what sex means?" I thought that was a great question. And anyways, the Supreme Court will decide, in the next couple of weeks, once and for all, whether men who think they're a woman can participate in women's sports. So this is pretty important hearing, Mark.
Yeah, this is a very important issue. So much of the transgender agenda it's a major assault on women's rights. If you don't have special rights as a woman, like even just to be able to have a change room or have your own sports, then we've lost, basic foundation of a reasonable and civilized society.
Yeah,
So I'm glad to see this one moving ahead. Go for it, U.S. Supreme Court.
yeah.
Here's another one out of the U.S. It's a unanimous decision this past week. The U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that the Yakimi Union Gospel Mission is free to hire like-minded employees who share and live out the mission's religious beliefs and purposes through its homeless shelter and other community service programs. So, Alliance Defending Freedom attorneys represented by the Yakimi Union Gospel Mission in challenging a Washington state law that limited its ability to hire individuals who share and live out its faith. The Ninth Circuit's ruling affirms that churches and religious ministries have autonomy to hire fellow believers for all positions. The Ninth Circuit correctly ruled that the First Amendment protects the mission's freedom to hire fellow believers who share that calling. The Yakimi Union Gospel Mission serves everyone regardless of background or belief, but it furthers its religious purpose by employing only like-minded believers who agree with and live out the mission's Christian beliefs and practices. But the Washington law threatened the mission with significant penalties and liability for hiring only those who share its religious beliefs and convictions. So this is a huge win for religious freedom and for common sense. After all, as the court pointed out in its ruling, personnel is policy. So Yakima Union Gospel Mission prioritizes the gospel in all it does to serve its community, but it can only remain a gospel-centered mission if it's staffed by those who believe the gospel. That sounds reasonable. What do you think, Ted?
Well, Mark, this speaks to what we just talked about a few minutes ago, is that clearly there's an attempt to take down Christianity. And here's a Christian organization that is doing good work in the community. They're providing homeless shelters, a variety of other community service programs, but they also use it as a way of serving their mission, which is to grow their ministry. And the state of Washington impose laws and threats of fines if they um, if they discriminated in their hiring by hiring only people with the same religious beliefs and convictions. And rightfully, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled, listen, this is their organization. They're providing the service. It's a religious-based service. They have the right to hire the people that are in alignment with that belief system. And I think it's a no-brainer, but obviously it had to take a court to make that decision to undo the harms of the state of Washington.
Yeah, I agree, Ted. And yeah, I could see some people just reflexively picking up the stick to beat down the church and beat down the Christians on this one. But this isn't really unusual. What's unusual is the suppression of it in a selected group. I mean, I think to, my own work for more than a decade, teaching advanced trauma life support with the American College of Surgeons as part of the advanced trauma life support system. And part of being an instructor, to be a professor of that, is that you have to really buy in to the advanced trauma life support system. You have to really believe that it's a good system. You have to have reviewed it and studied it and come to the conclusion, yeah, this is the way to approach trauma victims, physical trauma victims. And that was required of us. And I can't imagine, I mean, can you imagine if I went down to a synagogue and said, hey, I want to work in the synagogue, but I don't believe in your religion.
Yeah.
Or if I went to a mosque and said, yeah, hey, I want to be involved. I want to be leading things in the mosque here, but I don't believe in Muhammad. Like that would be nuts.
Well,
So
and
it's
then
good
to
to
make it
see.
worse is
Uh-huh.
that you've got a state that will then impose a fine on that church for not hiring you, right?
Yeah. Go down. Hi, I'm a Satan worshiper. I want to work in the church. You have to hire me. Equal opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion. Well, I mean, we're seeing,
Yeah,
this is a recurring theme in the winds today. We're seeing stepping away from the cliff of the madness. So that's a
yeah,
beautiful thing.
yeah.
Speaking of kids and neurodegenerative things and autism and poisons to the brain, we've got another big poison to the brain, fluoride. And we've got some good news about Procter and Gamble. What's this one about, Ted?
Well, Procter and Gamble, who's the makers of Crest fluoride toothpaste for children, have agreed that they will limit their deceptive marketing. And this was announced by the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. And under the terms of that agreement, Procter and Gamble will adjust the advertising specifically for children under the age of 6 so that their advertising reflects the age-appropriate amounts of toothpaste. And so the bottom line here is that fluoride is toxic and it causes neurological disorders and harm to children in particular. And what is actually recommended, the amount of toothpaste that's recommended if you're using a fluoride containing toothpaste is just basically a small little strip, a dab, a small dab of toothpaste. But if you look at their commercials or even the images that are on the box, there's this big full strip. And so they're being deceptive in the amount of toothpaste that's appropriate for a child. And so that's one issue that so Procter and Gamble has agreed to change the way that they marketed the product. But there's other things that also are being looked at here is that they're producing their toothpaste with candy and fruit juice flavors. They're using cartoon characters to appeal to younger children. They're misleading, I would suggest, both children and parents about the dangers. Like fluoridated toothpaste is a dangerous product and it needs to be treated as such. And they're treating it like candy. And the Attorney General in Texas is saying we're not going to have it. So in the grand scheme of things, this may not be a big win, but what it says to me is that there's starting to be some accountability for the lies and the deception that is happening, particularly by the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, so important. And for if there's some folks out there that Ted that, most of our audiences think is pretty on top of this issue because we've published a lot of science about fluoride. But folks, if you're picking us up a piece of this post anywhere, go to drtrozy.news, or you can go to Substack and go to Dr. Trozy, Dr. Trozy, search the word fluoride and get yourself informed. And Ted, do you ever notice when you're drinking water that taste of hydrofluorosilicic acid? I gotta admit, I can't taste it. And you know why? Because it's tasteless.
Mhm.
So when you take and you put in a kid's mouth a poison and you mix it with some fruity, juicy flavors with, cartoon
Yep.
characters juggling and smiling, you know what that kid's gonna do? He's gonna stick it in his mouth and swallow it. And you're one step closer to a child with a lower IQ by 3 to 9 IQ points by the time they're 15 to 20 years old.
Well, and exactly, and they even say on the packages that children are not to swallow the toothpaste, but I'm willing to bet that most kids swallow their toothpaste, right?
Oh, for sure. Folks, if you haven't done it already, like head down to your bathroom in your house, grab anything with fluoride in it and get rid of it. And don't put it in
Yep.
front of kids. And let's not wait for Procter and Gamble to make the full distance. Why don't they just make toothpaste? Like I get toothpaste that's fluoride free and I pay even on the budget of an honest Canadian doctor, I end up paying like double, three times and I just use a little bit. I'd rather use a little bit of something non-toxic,
Yeah.
and you can get toothpaste that actually will help with nutrients to restore your teeth and protect your teeth. So, folks, you know, get some real toothpaste and stop fluoridating yourself and your children
Yeah.
if you haven't already. Well, here's something, Ted. Young people who used to identify as transgender have filed dozens of lawsuits in the past few years. These people are known as detransitioners, those who regret changing their gender identity after making irreversible changes to their body via medication and surgery on the advice of medical professionals. So, anyways, this year, several cases have survived dismissal and arbitration and are making their way into the courtrooms across the country in the United States of America. One case in New York, scheduled to go trial this week, involves a then 16-year-old girl who thought she was a male. I wonder what kind of coercion helped her get to the
Yeah.
thinking. But anyways, she thought she was a male and she underwent a double mastectomy. No cancer, no COVID shot cancer. We're just talking a healthy 16-year-old girl physically. Anyways, medical professionals involved in the case are accused of negligence and causing pain, suffering, and mental anguish of a permanent nature to the plaintiff. The defendants allegedly failed to inform the teen of the risks, hazards, and alternatives involved in the medical procedures that she underwent. Doctors have a responsibility to rule out other potential causes of a patient's distress before turning to irreversible procedures such as double mastectomy or hysterectomy. Imagine that. Hey, I don't like the look of my hands. Well, we could amputate them.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, in marketing their service, the lawsuit said that the defendants used descriptions such as masculinizing hormone therapy to describe medical interventions for gender dysphoria. And these innocuous sounding procedure descriptions marketed by the defendants are deceptive because they're not therapy according to the lawsuit. In fact, they are the opposite. Rather than healing, these products inflict harm that causes malfunction and malformation of the teenage body and mind. And that's going to court in New York. Ted, you've kept your eye on this birdie for quite a while, I guess out of your love for humanity. And what are your thoughts on this moving ahead?
Well, again, finally, we're seeing some efforts at accountability here, and I hope that the doctors that are involved in the mutilation of our children receive severe punishment. I'd like to see them go to jail. And then my hope is that that ruling sends just a shockwave, not only through the United States, but throughout the world that says, if you're going to mutilate and harm our children with this nonsense, with this lie, you will go to jail. And so, it shocks me that there are so many doctors that are participating in this. I understand that the money involved is pretty significant, So that tells me that we've got doctors that are in the field of medicine because of money rather than being of service to patients. But COVID told us that unfortunately that's the reality with many.
Yeah. Yeah, Ted, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had some while ago with a pleasant fellow and who is a plastic surgeon. And as an emergency physician of many years, I've sutured a lot of wounds and doing a great job of suturing wounds, being able to turn a nasty wound into a nice, clean, minimalized scar that's highly functional. That's the kind of thing we love to do. And plastic surgeons take a lot of extra training in that. So, plastic surgeons are some group of people that I've always liked to draw from to learn more. I've done training in plastic surgery and things like that. And so when I met this fellow who was a plastic surgeon, and here we were, having coffee together, and I was like, oh, great. Tell me about your work. Like, I want to know about, repair of flexor tendons in the hand and all these really intricate, tricky things that plastic surgeons are good for. And he said, well, I don't really do much of that anymore. He says, he was in Europe, and he said, mostly I create the peniles and then describe the dissection of a young girl's forearm to take a portion of her forearm and create the tube-like structure that would hang over her urethra, and then the struggles to keep that tissue alive so that one can experience the delusion of something like a penis. So I'm all with the lawsuits here. Keep them coming. Keep them coming.
Yeah, yeah.
You got another item here, Ted, on within this same whole element of the sexualization, perversion of children, and the gender confusion of them. And this is something out of Massachusetts. What's
Yeah,
happening there?
yeah, it's another win there. It says a father in Massachusetts has won a preliminary injunction against a local school district that insisted on exposing his 5-year-old son to pro-LGBTQ books. The father objected to the content of certain books concerning sexual themes and contended that his child was being compelled to participate in classroom instruction that promotes sexualized and ideological messages contrary to his family's faith or belief. He also contended that as a parent that he had the right to be notified before his son is exposed to objectionable sexual material and to be able to opt out his child from the lessons and other classroom activities that involve those materials. So, as a result of the district's actions, the 5-year-old has been exposed to moral instruction. This is according to the father about marriage, sexuality, and family that directly contradicts the teachings of his family. This has required the father to be prepared to discuss sensitive topics related to sexuality, marriage, and family structures much earlier than he wanted to or believed is appropriate for the age of his child, 5 years old. Anyways, Boston's U.S. District Judge Dennis Saylor ordered both the school district and the school to make reasonable efforts to ensure that the boy is not taught or otherwise exposed to the content of the books that were identified, whether in the classroom or any other school setting. The court clarified that the schools cannot place the burden on parents to identify every specific material they objected to. The father said his request to opt his son out of kindergarten classroom exposure to the LBTQ theme materials had been repeatedly rejected by the school. I'm Mark, I'm just appalled by how these schools, these teachers, these principals, these school boards think that they have the right to impose their ideology on our children. That's not why we send our kids to school. And when a parent like this father is very clear that he does not want his son to be exposed to this kind of ideology, they reject that. That's pretty disgusting in my view. Fortunately, this father has won an injunction against this while this goes to court. But we shouldn't have to go to court to protect our kids from this kind of nonsense. Mark, what do you
Well,
think?
we should. Well, we sure shouldn't. And I'm going to make sure to put some links in the printed material on Substack and on drtrozy.news for people to dive into this. Because Ted, you and I have looked at some of the books in the schools in Canada, for instance. And I'm not trying to be graphic, folks. If there's children in the room, please, ask them to leave for a sec. But when you literally have kids, little children, imagine your kindergarten son studying a book where an adult man is kneeling down and pulling on the penis of a young boy as if it's normal. Or a guy with the beard and boobs is dancing across the screen while someone else is committing sodomy. Like you don't need a PhD in psychology to know that that is extremely screwed up. And so I definitely salute this Massachusetts father and, remind folks like if you're not watching this subject, there's a lot of ways to destroy your kid. It's not just COVID
Mhm.
shots. It's not just poisoning them. It's not just fluoride. Like if your child gets exposed to pornography, you don't erase it. Like you've got to deal with it. And that's what this
Yeah,
father, I think, is partly saying. He's like, my
yeah,
kid comes home screwed up with like concepts of sodomy as opposed to, well, what should you be doing in kindergarten? Got the whole world in his hands, that kind of stuff. You can't. You've got to deal with it, and there's no undoing it. It's just like the shot. You can't take it out. You can't suck the injection out of the kid. You got to deal with it. And when somebody exposes your kid to this stuff at an industrial level in the school system, and of course it's all a WHO operation. And folks, if that doesn't make sense to you, please look at the paid subscribe material and click the links. We'll put lots of related material and show you how the WHO runs this sexualization of children. So I feel really happy about this one and grateful to LifeSite News for reporting it, Ted.
yeah, yeah.
So Ted, that brings us to citizens
Mhm.
action. What have we got going on in citizens action?
Well, Fatine put a call out in the last couple of weeks. She's developed a call to action that she calls 12 Days for Freedom. And she's inviting people across Canada who are concerned about Bill C9, which I believe is, I think it's called the hate bill, but I think it's a censorship bill, to participate in a program where they make an agreement to call five members of parliament each day for 12 days. So that means you take 10 or 15 minutes to call, make those five phone calls. You tell them that you're concerned about Bill C9. You want the MP to vote it down, vote against it so that it doesn't proceed. I think it's moving into third reading. And anyways, she put out a call for that, and she was hoping for 200 people to participate in this call to action. Well, she sent around an email this morning to say 670 people have registered to participate. And if each one of those people makes their five calls a day at a minimum, that's over 40,000 calls that our elected representatives in Canada here will get over the next 12 days expressing concern about Bill C9. So I think it's a fabulous call to action by Fatine, and I'm absolutely thrilled so many people signed up to be part of it. I signed up to be part of it. Yesterday was the first day for those phone calls. I made my five calls to MPs. I got four answering machines and one live body. And I just expressed my concern. I said, Canada isn't a hateful country. This is not about hate. I believe this is about censorship. And I said, what we need in this country is not less conversation. We need more conversation. And I think this bill will send a chilling effect on people to because they're afraid of being literally jailed if they say something that the federal government deems to be hate. And I just think that they're using that term very intentionally to evoke emotional reaction instead of a logical response. And I think it's a very dangerous bill. So congratulations to Fatine and 670 people who are participating in that.
Yeah, thanks for everyone participating and others who might choose to. And
Mm.
the links in the material on Substack, drrosie.news. And if you're just picking this up somewhere, if you go to www.zeffy.com, I think you'd be able to search for 12 Days for Freedom and find it there.
Yeah.
Well, this one I was really impressed with, Ted. This came out of Minnesota. So a Minnesota daycare fraud wasn't uncovered by police or mainstream investigative journals. It was uncovered by Nick Shirley, who is a 23-year-old journalist, and she's the one who did their job for them. So while the big network sat on the story for years, Shirley grabbed a camera and went door to door. In one afternoon, he uncovered $110 million in fraud. Buildings licensed for 120 children with zero kids inside, yet pulling in $3 million a year from taxpayers. Nick knocked on doors and asked simple questions, and then he filmed what happened when he did. And the result, 139.4 million views on X, 3.5 million views on YouTube. Mainstream media suddenly covering the story that they had ignored. And folks, the link is here for that. There's 42 minutes of primary footage from Shirley's investigation. Isn't that amazing, Ted, what this fellow did, Nick?
Yeah, yeah. So this is encouraging. This and it's why it's under citizen action. This tells you what one person can do, the difference they can make. And he really exposed this massive fraud, daycare fraud that's happening in Minnesota. And that's not the only fraud happening there. There's, boy, Minnesota really is a pretty curious place, we're discovering.
Yeah. Well, we got some heroes of citizen action now. And of course, here comes one of our superheroes. What's going on with Tamara Lich?
Well, and we reported just a few weeks ago that Tamara Leach was being employed by Rebel News as a reporter. Well, she started her work this week. And there's video clips of her. If you go to Rebel News, you'll see Tamara on streets in downtown Toronto and asking the passerbys that whether they're concerned about free speech in Canada. So delighted to see Tamara out of her home. You know, she's still there under house arrest, but part of the terms of the house arrest is that she can be out for work. And Rebel News hired her, and she's starting to do her work, and nice to see. So God bless Tamara Leach.
Yeah, God bless you, Tamara Leach. Hope you're watching the show and feeling all the good vibes. Well, Ted, that brings us, we still got wins to go, folks, and that brings us into the telling it like it is truth bombs department. And John Rappaport, who I've enjoyed for a long time, he shared a blistering quote of Dr. David Ross about the FDA. So Ross was a consummate insider. Dr. Ross spent 10 years at the FDA's Center of Drug Evaluation and Review as a medical officer, senior medical reviewer, medical team leader, and new drug review office management official. And he has extremely broad experience with FDA regulatory submissions. And here is his quote, which was published in the BMJ journal. And here, check this out, folks. The corruption of the FDA's scientific culture remains the primary culprit driving the deterioration of safety and effectiveness standards. During my tenure at FDA, managers would admiringly speak of crafting an approval as if it were a skillful demonstration of regulatory legerdemain rather than an act of scientific fabrication. By the way, folks, that fancy word legerdemain means an act of conjuring, trickery, deception. So, in other words, the managerial pros at the FDA admired the crafting of lies and clever half truths and pure bullshit that won FDA approval for drugs. And it is a skill, if you don't mind killing and maiming people with the devastating drugs that are approved through this process. Thank you, John Rappaport and Dr. David Ross. Ted, it is still shocking. You never quite get used to this, do you?
No, no. And what is the win here is that it's being called out, it's finally being spoken about out loud, which is often a lot what these particular truth bombs are, what the win is in them.
Yeah. And it should be really clear to folks because I still get these trolls that kind of troll along and make comments and on my channels, oh, you're a grifter and all this stuff. And not many of them, but these people made a lot of money doing this.
Mm.
And everyone who stood against it up until recently and even now has been brutally assaulted. I mean, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Patrick Phillips, Reiner Fuelmich. I mean, at multiple layers, the whole official approval of drugs industry has been nothing but a scam and really a crime spree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we got something here about one of my real favorite Canadian reporters. What's going on with Tamara Ugolini?
Well, she's one of the fine Rebel News reporters as well. I saw a piece that she did this week where she's exposing the coercion that exists in Ontario schools where they continue to force children to get vaccinated or lose access to education. And she did a lot of interviews with parents, and they really talk about the coercion process that's there. In many cases, if not most cases, parents are not told that there is an exemption process in Ontario. They're simply told that your child has to be fully up to date in their vaccines or they can't come to school. And if they show up, they will be suspended for 21 days, which, when you include weekends, is actually a month of schooling. And it's being imposed, inconsistently. So I'm aware of some schools that will simply ignore that if your kid is unvaccinated, and other ones they will suspend you over and over and over again. So month after month after month. So it is a terrible situation in Ontario. I've mentioned this before. There's only two provinces in Canada with vaccine mandates for kids to go to school. That's Ontario and New Brunswick. And Ontario is by far the most egregious. They force parents to sign an affidavit that says that by not vaccinating even with one vaccine, that you are knowingly putting your child and other children at risk. And that's a lie. Anyways, Rebel News has launched a petition to stop vaccine coercion, and you can find it at stopvaccinecoercion.com. So good for them.
Yeah, that's excellent. Big fan of Tamara Ugolini. Thanks for everything you're doing, Tamara. Ted, you put this in the context of everything else we're talking about today, and because people have to take it down to a practical thing. Your kid goes to school, they say, we got to inject this with some poison, essentially, or they can't come to school and learn about sodomy. So what are you going to do? Keep them home and teach them long division. That would be my advice.
Yep.
But you can't apply for exemptions, and religious exemption counts. Well, this is something from Greg Douglas, who asked some very uncomfortable questions in a recent post. And Greg wrote, I understand why many people are furious about the killing of Renee Good by ICE. A woman is dead, and whenever state power ends a civilian life, that should trigger outrage and scrutiny. But I want to ask something uncomfortable and honestly, something worth sitting with for a moment. When ICE acts under a Trump administration, the outrage is instant, intense, and morally absolute. Orange man bad, therefore the act itself must be proof of systemic evil. Yet, when the RCMP, acting under Justin Trudeau's federal authority, used mounted police to charge a crowd in Ottawa, knocking down a grandmother who posed no threat to officers or anyone else, where was the same outrage? She didn't die, thankfully, but anyone being trampled by a horse carries a very real risk of death or catastrophic injury. And unlike the Good case, and by Good, I'm talking the surname Renee Good, who was shot, this woman, so the woman in the Canadian parade wasn't doing what Renee Good was doing, which was ramming officers with a vehicle or presenting an immediate physical threat. In the case of the Canadian protester, she was standing at a peaceful protest. So, again, here's an honest question. Why was one incident framed as uncomfortable state violence while the other was brushed off as unfortunate, necessary, or contextual? And it is because one can be pinned to Trump, someone you already despise, while the other happened under Trudeau, someone you broadly support, if you're a brainwashed guinea pig. Sorry, I added that last part. Is it because outrage feels safer when it aligns neatly with existing political teams? If your reaction was, this is horrifying when Trump's government was involved, but well, it's complicated when Trudeau's government was, that's not a coincidence. That's selective moral outrage. You have been programmed. This isn't about defending ICE, Trump, the RCMP, or Trudeau. It's about asking whether we apply the same standard state power and use of force, regardless of who's in office. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, well, that's probably the point, isn't it? Well said by Greg Douglas.
Yeah, this is a emotional one to wade into, and I appreciate Greg's courage to do that because I think we all need to ask some questions about whether our moral outrage, whether it's consistent or whether it varies depending on who is being called out here. So I just appreciate his questions, and I thought it fit perfectly under this category of, well, let's explore some truth bombs.
Yeah, yeah, sure is an important one. Well, we got some more news from your home province.
Yeah, on January the 6th, BC Minister for Community Safety Terry Young stood in front of a London Drugs in downtown Vancouver and bragged about the NDP's accomplishments in reducing crime. Less than 24 hours later, a downtown Vancouver London Drugs announced it is permanently closing its doors. The reason? Crime and disorder. A senior London Drugs officer said, over several years, we faced persistent safety incidences and significant operating losses at the site. According to the same spokesperson, customers no longer wanted to walk around the area because they were worried about their safety, and London Drugs employees felt unsafe as well. So they're saying, isn't it bizarre that less than 24 hours before you have an NDP minister in charge of our safety telling us everything is just fine? And the kicker is London Drugs warned BC Premier David Eby more than 2 years ago that this was going on. So what they're saying is this is not a new problem, this is a neglected one. That seems like a pretty good truth bomb.
Yeah, that's a great report, Ted. And this also speaks to the level of delusion, I would hope, rather than the level of mental control that people like Terry Young, the BC Minister for Community Safety, hold over the public mind because they
Mm.
can stand there on a rainy day and tell you it's a beautiful sunny sky. Like they just lie bald faced to you, and they think because they got the TV camera pointed at them, financed by the government and its propaganda campaigns, that it makes it real. And I'm grateful, and I hope more and more people are waking up and evaluating reality for themselves. And people like Terry Young get called out full speed.
Yeah.
Well, here's one in an essay that Molly Inglehart titled Responsibility is the Forgotten Root of Freedom. Engelhart wrote this. People often ask me why those who live outside cities tend to resist regulation and government interference more instinctively. Many assume the divide must be political, Republican versus Democratic, conservative versus liberal, red versus blue. But the real distinction is far simpler and far more human. When you live rurally, you must take responsibility for more of your own life, and responsibility changes you. When infrastructure fails, the system doesn't swoop in. We do. The scarcity of service creates skills. We grow our own food because stores are far away. We fix tractors and equipment because mechanics are further. We solve problems not because we romanticize self reliance, but because life requires it. When you have to provide for yourself, you understand that freedom and responsibility are not opposites, they're the same thing.
Mm.
Responsibility teaches ownership, ownership teaches consequence, and consequence shapes how you see the world. Responsibility equals freedom because it removes the illusion that someone else will save you from the cost of your own life. When you live responsible for the infrastructure of your own life, you understand that freedom is not handed out, it is defended by capability. The more responsibly we carry our own lives, the more reverence we develop for the freedom that it protects. That's a beautiful insight from Molly. What do you think, Ted?
Oh, I thought this was a beautiful message, and it really, I think it's important that we understand the relationship between responsibility and freedom. And I think we're living in a society where there seems to be very little responsibility, very little accountability. They always put it on somebody else. And I think we can also do harm to our kids as parents by not giving them enough responsibility. But when you're responsible, they talk about it, like you develop skills, you develop discernment, you become more resourceful, and that actually gives you more freedom. And so I just thought this was a beautiful essay that Molly Englehart wrote, and I wanted to share it with our audience here, Mark.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing, Ted. And, Ted, this touches on a little philosophical point that I find very useful, so I can't help but want to share it. But is the concept of resource-based thinking rather than economic-based thinking. And this comes from the addendum of Zeitgeist and a wise old philosopher. And by that, and this is more common in the country, and this is a great habit. I think to work on, I recommend it, is when you think of what you're trying to accomplish. There's a tendency in an economic based thinking, which maybe in this context of this essay would be a little more common in city folk, but I don't want to nail people on where they live too much. But where you think, oh, this is a problem. Where do I buy the solution? Where do I get the solution? What do I need to buy? Whereas
Right.
when you think resource, you think, here's something I want to create or something I want to solve or something I want to fix. How do I do it with what I have?
Hmm.
And that's such a level of freedom, both in terms of just being able to do stuff and that fun feeling of being creative, but it's a great move economically. It's very empowering. And so I think we can all take a little bit from country folk. If you've know some good farmers, yeah, go spend a weekend helping them out. You'd be amazed how much you'll learn with the
Yeah.
things that a farmer has to do to make it through the week.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we got some unusual words of wisdom from an unusual source. Ted, please tell us about this.
Yeah. Somebody shared this with me this week, and I just thought there was some good wisdom in it. So that's why I've included and it comes from Chat GPT. And so somebody asked Chat GPT, they said, if you were the devil, what would you do? That's a pretty interesting question, Mark. And
Yeah.
the response given by Chat GPT was this. It said, if I were the devil, not a horned monster, but the symbolic embodiment of human downfall, I wouldn't focus on violence or chaos. Those are obvious and usually resisted. I'd do quieter, subtler things. I'd work through comfort, not cruelty. People fall faster when they're comfortable than when they're threatened. I'd make distractions abundant, pleasure easy, and meaning optional. No chains, just couches. I'd blur truth rather than deny it. Lies are fragile. Confusion is durable. I'd flood the world with half-truths, outrage, and endless takes until people couldn't tell what mattered anymore and stopped trying. I'd encourage division without hatred. Hatred burns out, indifference lasts. I'd nudge people to see others as categories instead of humans, labels instead of stories. I'd whisper, not shout. I wouldn't say do evil. I'd say you deserve this, or just this once, or everybody else does it, or it doesn't really matter. I'd make people postpone their values, not abandon them, just delay them. Be kind later. Be brave when it's safer. How about that one, Mark? Be honest when it's convenient. Most of all, I'd convince people I don't exist. Not literally, but morally. I'd make them believe that responsibility is abstract, consequences are distant, and character is optional. And the irony, none of this requires supernatural power. It already works whenever people stop paying attention. I am already inside your mind. Whether you let me grow or not is your power. What do you think of that, Mark Trozy?
Well, I think there's something very interesting about having ChatGPT describe what to do as the devil. And
Yeah,
obviously ChatGPT has been, when you look at the massive data centers running this AI and accumulating thoughts from everyone, it's amazing that it didn't just come out with a simple answer. I mean, it's right off like, let's not talk about a horned monster. Let's go into like the symbolic of the embodiment of the human downfall. And basically it describes what's been going on by most of the old world institutions, educational institutions, courts, media. So I think it's pretty accurate.
yeah. Well, and the line that stood out for me was be brave when it's safe or be honest when it's convenient. You know, you and I both believe that during COVID, if there were more people that stood up and said, I will not comply, I will not go along with this, it would have been over long ago. But they chose safety and they chose convenience over honesty and bravery.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true. And
pretty good message.
pretty good message. It makes us want to make a salute to all of the heroes and a lot of the people in the audience who you might not be famous or whatever, but you're probably famous among your friends for the courage that you've demonstrated
Yeah.
and, making applying your morals and applying your diligence in life today, not someday as you lay on the couch, just getting vegged out and neutralized through comfort. Well, Ted, we got that's kind of the end of our main list. We got a few other things we want to talk about. One of the things is actions of the week. So we've got some great connections. Ted talked about earlier 12 days for freedom, that action. And the link is in all the published material for paid subscribers, but you can go to zephy.com and look for 12 days for freedom and join the now almost 700 people, probably more as we speak, calling politicians every day and helping to steer the ship away from Bill C9, the censorship
Yeah.
and authoritarian act. We've got Ontario and New Brunswick residents ending vaccine mandates for children, and this is a call to action to send a letter to your elected representative to end vaccine mandates. You can do it with one click at standforhealthfreedom.com. And then for BC residents, we've got the action to end vaccine coercion. Also stand for health freedom. And then lastly, Alberta parents, and I think we have another call to action as well, but Alberta parents signing the petition to increase access to the school board meetings so that you can know what's going on with your kids.
Yeah.
And you'll find that at the Alberta Parents Union.ca. And of course, Ted, I think the one you described earlier is if you're in Alberta, get on out there, get your friends out there, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
sign that call for a referendum on exiting the matrix of the Canadian dictatorship. Well, Ted, we got one other thing to talk about we want to share. Actually, it's going to lead to the beautiful song of the day, but it also deals with the very heavy subject and the important work we're doing. And I'd like to, remind folks, please, if you're in a position to support, just by sharing it, just by promoting it, or if you can donate, on the subject of what is happening to people who took these injections, we have the Villa Health Research Fund, where myself and a group of scientists are completely voluntary, putting a lot of time into analyzing the data of thousands of people to get a deeper understanding of what's happening to our loved ones. And in many cases, ourselves. A lot of you have been coerced and injected. And then the startup fundraiser of the Trozy team to create, and the homework's all done, folks. We just need a little bit to get it out there so people can affordably get, bar none, the absolute best, over the top, blow everything out of the market that's out there at an affordable price supplement kit to help detoxify their bodies and survive and thrive through this unusual, the world has been spiked era. And so the reason I brought those things up is because, Ted, you received a communication from a dear friend who, just by looking at her music, which we're going to share, I discovered as an amazing, beautiful human being. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about that, Ted, and about this amazing person and musician, Denise Hagen.
Yeah, it's a good friend of my wife and I, and she's just this beautiful, angelic singer. We got a message this week that she's got serious health considerations, life-threatening. She was one of those souls that was coerced to take the shot for a variety of reasons. And my heart breaks for her. And this is one of her songs that I most really appreciate. And I'll just give you a little of the background of it. She was at a stage in her life many, many years ago where she was not doing well. She was actually thinking about whether she wanted to stick around or whether she just wanted to leave and be done with it. And she was in bed one night. She said, I was crying, and I said to God, God, if you want me to stick around, you better send me a message. Otherwise, I'm going to look for a way to exit. And she said later that night, she woke up in the middle of the night, and there was a figure at the end of her bed. And she looked, and she said it was Jesus. And Jesus delivered a message to her. And that message is what is the words of this song, Perfect Replications, that we're going to play as an outgoing song. And I think when you just think, whether you believe that or not, the words of the song are beautiful. But if you actually think that that experience that she described to me was true, it just means that there's something much more beautiful happening than we understand. And so I hope people will take a listen to Denise's song.
Yeah, folks, I hope you really enjoy this. You may have noticed in the last few weeks that our outro song, that you actually have to click a link when the video will end in a moment to actually watch the song. And that's so the views go to the channel of the person, in this case, this wonderful woman, Denise Hagen. I listened to the song earlier, and I'm going to close my eyes and listen to it again. And I brought tears of joy and awe and wonder. I think all of us can relate to it. I think we're all due for a little message from God to lift us up and feel that we are God's children. I want to let you folks know as well that we will be reaching out, not forcing anything, but we're definitely going to be reaching out to Denise to bring help to her situation, because as we've all learned in the last 5 years, there's a lot of great solutions to a lot of hard problems, and you're not finding them in the old medical, military, industrial complex. So we're going to reach out to Denise to help her. And here's Denise reaching out to help you. Folks, please click the link and enjoy this song, Perfect Replications by Denise Hagen. I hope that this lifts your spirits and increases yet again the depth of your conscious pool, and that you have an absolutely fabulous week. Keep helping making the winds happen. Thank you, Ted Kuntz, brother. God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Trozy. Always a pleasure. See you next week.
Thanks, Ted. Until next week.